The millionaire's son lay still on the marble floor, eyes shut, body cold with shock, while the maid knelt beside him, her hands shaking, holding something small, dark, and moving. "Grace, what did you do?" the butler gasped, frozen by fear. Footsteps thundered through the mansion. Mr. Caleb Thompson, the man whose money could buy almost anything, burst into the room, his face pale with horror. "What happened to my son?" he shouted, rushing forward. Grace's lips trembled as she looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't hurt him, sir," she whispered. "I swear, I was only trying to help." "Help?" Caleb barked, his voice echoing through the wide hall. "You touched my son? You went near him without my permission?" Grace slowly opened her palm. Inside it was something no one had ever seen before, something strange, dark, and wet that glistened under the light. Everyone in the room took a step back, their faces pale. The air was thick, silent, and heavy, until a soft sound broke through it. "Dad!" It came from the same boy who had been born deaf, the same boy who had never spoken a single word in his life. For a moment, no one moved, not even Caleb. And that was when he realized the maid had just done the impossible. Dear viewers, this is an emotional story about love, faith, and the kind of miracle that money could never buy. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will touch your heart and remind you that sometimes the most powerful healing comes from the people we least expect. The Thompson mansion was a place where even silence had its own sound. Every corner gleamed, every chandelier shined like gold, yet something felt missing. The house was huge, but it carried an emptiness no decoration could hide. Servants moved quietly from one room to another, careful not to make noise. They said the master of the house, Mr. Caleb Thompson, liked things that way. Caleb was a man who lived for perfection. His world was made of schedules, meetings, and contracts worth millions. But behind the calm look on his face was a father who could not sleep at night. His only son, Ethan, had been born deaf. No medicine, no doctor, no expensive treatment had changed that. He had spent years flying across countries, paying experts who promised hope, but each time he came home with the same empty silence. Ethan was 10 years old now. He had never heard the sound of rain, never heard his father's voice, never said a single word. The only sound he knew was what he saw on other people's lips when they spoke. Sometimes he would sit by the window and press his ear to the glass, watching the trees move as if they were whispering secrets he could never hear. The mansion staff had learned to speak to him using signs, though most barely tried. Some pitied him, others feared him, as if his silence carried bad luck. But one person looked at him differently. Her name was Grace. Grace was new in the mansion. A young black maid in her mid-20s, she had come looking for work after her mother's illness left her with hospital bills she could not pay. She wore the same uniform every day, washed carefully by hand each night, and tied her hair neatly in a bun. Grace worked quietly, never complaining, never gossiping. But beneath her calm face lived a heart full of memories she could not forget. Grace once had a little brother named Daniel. He had lost his hearing after a strange infection when they were children. She remembered how the doctors turned them away because they couldn't afford the treatment. She remembered the helpless look on her mother's face, and how Daniel died in silence, never hearing her voice again. Since then, Grace carried a silent promise inside her heart. If she ever met another child like him, she would never look away. The first time Grace saw Ethan, he was sitting on the marble staircase, arranging toy cars in a straight line. He didn't look up when she passed, but she noticed something strange about him. He didn't move like most children did. He was too careful, too still. His eyes were full of something she recognized: loneliness. From that day, Grace started leaving little things for him on the steps. A folded paper bird, a small chocolate wrapped in gold, a short note with a drawing. At first, Ethan didn't react, but one morning, she found the chocolate gone, and the paper bird sitting beside his toys. Slowly, something began to change. When Grace cleaned the windows near his playroom, he would come close, watching her reflection. She would smile and wave. He started waving back. When she dropped a cup once, he laughed silently, holding his stomach with both hands. It was the first time anyone in the mansion had seen him smile. Day by day, Grace became the only person Ethan trusted. She taught him small hand signs, and he taught her how to see joy in small things. She didn't treat him like a patient. She treated him like a boy who deserved to be heard in his own way. But not everyone was happy about it. One evening, while Grace was wiping the dining table, the head butler whispered sharply, "You should stay away from him. Mr. Thompson doesn't like the staff getting too close." Grace looked up, startled. "But he seems happier," she said quietly. "That's not your concern," the butler replied. "You're here to clean, not to bond." Grace said nothing, but her heart disagreed. She knew what loneliness looked like, and she saw it every time she looked into Ethan's eyes. That night, while the rest of the staff went to their quarters, Grace sat by the kitchen window, thinking. The sound of the clock ticked slowly. She remembered Daniel, her brother, and how no one cared enough to notice his pain. She couldn't let that happen again. The next morning, she found Ethan sitting in the garden, scratching his ear and frowning. He seemed uncomfortable. Grace knelt beside him and gently signed, "Are you okay?" He shook his head. She leaned closer, tilting his head slightly to see inside. The sunlight fell on his ear, and for a second, she saw something that made her heart stop. Deep inside, something dark was glistening. Grace blinked, unsure of what she had just seen. It looked like a small shadow moving, but she thought maybe she was wrong. She didn't touch him, just smiled and said softly, "Let's tell your father, okay?" Ethan shook his head and signed quickly. "No doctors." His hands trembled as he signed again. "They hurt me." Grace froze. Pain flashed in his eyes, and in that moment, she understood everything. He wasn't just afraid of hospitals. He was terrified. That night, she couldn't sleep. The picture of that dark thing inside his ear haunted her. What if it was something serious? What if it was the reason he could never hear? She thought of calling someone, but then remembered how the mansion worked. Without Mr. Thompson's approval, no one listened, and Mr. Thompson barely spoke to her at all. The next day, the unease grew worse. Ethan kept touching his ear, wincing in pain. Grace followed him into the playroom, her heart beating fast with worry. She didn't know what to do, but she couldn't ignore it any longer. She whispered to herself, "Lord, guide me, please." When Ethan winced again and tears filled his eyes, Grace made a choice that would change everything. She reached into her pocket and took out a small silver pin she used to fix her uniform. She knelt beside him and said quietly, "It's okay, I'll help you." And at that exact moment, as her trembling hand moved closer, the door behind her creaked open. Someone was watching. The sound of the creaking door made Grace freeze. She turned slowly and saw Mr. Caleb Thompson standing by the doorway. His suit was perfect as always, his face calm but sharp, like a man who was used to being obeyed. "What are you doing?" His voice was low but heavy. Grace quickly stood up, hiding the small silver pin behind her back. "Sir, I'm sorry," she said softly. "He was in pain. I was just trying to help him." Caleb's eyes went from her to his son. Ethan sat on the floor, holding his ear and blinking. He wasn't crying, but his face showed discomfort. "You're not a doctor," Caleb said firmly. "If something is wrong with my son, you call me. You don't touch him." Grace lowered her head. "Yes, sir. I understand." He sighed deeply, running his hand across his face. "I've had too many people promising to help him. All of them failed. I can't take chances anymore." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, but he quickly straightened up. "You can go now," he added. Grace nodded. holding back the tears rising in her eyes. She wanted to speak, to tell him what she saw, but his tone told her not to. She turned and walked away quietly, her steps slow and heavy. When she got to the hallway, she leaned against the wall and whispered, "He doesn't know how much that boy is suffering." Hours passed. The mansion returned to its quiet rhythm. The maids polished furniture, the cook prepared dinner, and the guards stood outside like statues. But inside Grace's heart, the silence was louder than ever. She couldn't stop thinking about Ethan, the way he had touched his ear, the dark thing she thought she saw inside, the fear in his eyes when he said, "No doctors." That night, she went to her small room behind the laundry area and sat on the edge of her bed. Her Bible lay open beside her, though she wasn't reading. She just stared at the pages and whispered, "Lord, what do I do?" The old clock ticked slowly. She thought of her brother Daniel again. The memory of his last day came rushing back, the way he had looked at her, trying to say something he couldn't. She had promised herself she would never stand by and watch another child suffer. Grace stood up suddenly. She couldn't sleep. She walked back through the empty hallway, her bare feet silent against the cold floor. The lights were dim, the house asleep. Only the faint hum of air conditioning filled the air. She stopped outside Ethan's room. The door was slightly open. Inside, the small night lamp glowed softly. Ethan was awake, sitting on his bed, his hands pressed to his ear again. Grace slowly walked in. "It hurts again?" she signed gently. He nodded, his eyes wet. Grace's heart ached. She knelt beside the bed and looked closer. "Let me see," she whispered. He hesitated, then leaned forward. The lamp's light touched his small ear, and again she saw it, something deep inside, glistening faintly. This time she was sure. Something did not belong there. Her breath caught. "It's okay," she whispered, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'll be gentle." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver pin. Her hand trembled. "Just hold still, all right?" Ethan looked scared but nodded. She took a slow breath and gently moved the pin closer. Her fingers shook so badly she could barely hold it steady. The small, dark shape seemed to move deeper, like it was hiding. "Please, Lord," she whispered, "guide me." Then she felt it. The tip of the pin touched something soft and sticky. Carefully, she hooked it and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then something slid out, small and wet, falling into her palm. It was black, round, and slightly moving. Grace froze. Her heart almost stopped. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it shouldn't have been inside a child's ear. Ethan's eyes went wide. He touched his ear, blinking fast, confused. Then he gasped. Grace leaned forward, scared. "Ethan, are you okay?" His hands went to his throat, and then his mouth opened. A small sound came out, rough, broken, but real. Grace's whole body froze, her lips parted, and her eyes filled with tears. You spoke." The sound came again, soft but clearer. "Grace." Her heart stopped. He had just said her name. She dropped the pin, her hands shaking. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You can hear me?" Ethan covered his ears suddenly, flinching at the noise of the ticking clock on the wall. His eyes filled with fear, but also wonder. Grace moved closer, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's okay," she said, her voice trembling. "It's okay. You're hearing for the first time." Ethan looked around the room, his face full of confusion and shock. He pointed to the window as the wind rustled the curtains. "Sound?" he asked in a shaky voice. Grace nodded, smiling through her tears. "Yes, that's sound." She didn't notice the door opening again. The butler stood there, eyes wide, frozen. "What on earth?" Grace turned around, startled. "Please, don't shout," she whispered quickly. "He can hear now. I don't know how, but he can hear." But the butler didn't believe her. He stepped back and shouted, "Mr. Thompson, come quickly!" Ethan jumped at the loud voice, covering his ears again, whimpering. Grace hugged him gently. "It's okay. It's okay. Don't be scared." Heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. Caleb appeared at the doorway, his face pale, his voice like thunder. "What is going on here?" The butler pointed at Grace. "Sir," she was touching him again, "and look at the boy." Caleb's eyes went from the butler to his son. Ethan was shaking, clinging to Grace, his lips moving as if he was trying to say something. Then, out of nowhere, a single word came out. "Dad." The room went completely still. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. His body froze as if time itself had stopped. For years, he had dreamed of hearing that one word. Grace looked at him with tears running down her face. "He can hear, sir," she whispered. "He really can." Caleb couldn't move. The butler stood speechless. Even the clock seemed to stop ticking. Then Ethan spoke again, his voice weak but real. "Dad, don't be mad." Caleb's legs gave way slightly. His eyes glistened. He whispered to himself, "That's my boy's voice." But the shock turned quickly into anger. His voice rose. "What did you do to him? What did you put in his ear?" Grace shook her head, terrified. "I didn't hurt him, sir. I only pulled out something that was inside." "Something?" Caleb shouted. "You could have killed him." Before Grace could answer, the sound of running feet filled the hall. Security guards rushed in, surrounding her. "Sir, please," Grace cried. "Listen to me. He can hear now." But Caleb's voice was cold. "Take her away." As the guards grabbed her arms, Ethan screamed, "No!" It was the loudest word he had ever said. And the last thing Grace heard, as she was dragged away, was the boy crying her name. Grace sat in the security room, her hands cuffed together, tears drying on her face. The guards stood near the door, silent, waiting for orders. From the hall, she could still hear Ethan's faint crying. Every time he shouted her name, her heart broke a little more. She whispered to herself, "God, please let them see I didn't hurt him." Upstairs, the mansion was chaos. Caleb was pacing back and forth in the living room, his mind spinning. His son had spoken. He had heard his voice. It was impossible. For 10 years, every doctor said it would never happen, yet a maid had done it in minutes. The butler tried to speak softly. "Sir, maybe we should call the hospital. The boy might be in danger." Caleb nodded quickly. "Yes, call them now. Tell them to send an ambulance. I want every specialist ready." Within minutes, flashing lights filled the driveway. Paramedics entered the mansion and carried Ethan gently on a stretcher. The boy kept trying to speak, his small voice trembling. "Dad." "Grace." Grace helped. But Caleb couldn't even look at Grace. He followed the stretcher outside, his heart torn between confusion and fear. He didn't know if what happened was a miracle or a mistake. At the hospital, the air smelled of disinfectant and worry. Machines beeped softly. Doctors in white coats rushed around. Caleb stood behind the glass wall, watching as they checked his son. His hands trembled slightly, something he hadn't felt in years. He had faced investors, politicians, and world leaders, but now, in front of his own son, he felt helpless. One of the doctors came out and spoke carefully. "Mr. Thompson, we ran quick tests. His hearing seems restored. Temporarily, at least." Caleb blinked. "Temporarily? What does that mean?" The doctor adjusted his glasses nervously. "We don't know yet. We found signs of irritation in his ear and some kind of foreign substance. We'll need to run deeper tests." "Foreign substance?" Caleb repeated, his chest tightening. "What kind of substance?" The doctor hesitated. "Something biological. We've never seen anything like it. It could have been there for years." Caleb turned pale. "Years? You're telling me all these specialists who treated him never noticed?" The doctor avoided his eyes. "Sometimes these things are complicated." Caleb's voice rose, but he kept it low enough not to scare Ethan. Complicated? I paid you people millions. Every year, I flew him across the world for treatments. You scanned every part of him. And you missed something sitting right inside his ear? The doctor swallowed hard and said quietly, "Mr. Thompson, maybe you should sit down. There's something else." He opened a folder and slid it across the table. Caleb frowned and looked down. Inside were medical reports, signed and stamped. He started reading, his eyes moving faster with every line. Then he stopped. At the bottom of one report were printed words that made his stomach twist. Maintain diagnosis for continued funding approval. Thompson account remains active. Caleb's mouth went dry. He read it again, just to be sure. It said exactly what he feared. They had been lying. His son was never treated. They had kept him deaf to keep the money coming. He slammed the folder shut, his whole body shaking. You monsters," he whispered. "You sold my son's pain for profit." The doctor looked down, ashamed. "Sir, I had no knowledge of that part. The board handles those accounts." Caleb didn't even hear him anymore. He turned and walked straight out of the office, his head spinning. Every step felt heavy, like guilt pressing on his shoulders. He had trusted them. He had believed every promise because it was easier than facing the truth. At the end of the hallway, he saw Ethan sitting up on the hospital bed. The boy was smiling weakly, a bandage near his ear. He looked small and fragile, but alive. Caleb's chest tightened. For the first time, his son looked at him and heard him breathe. "Dad," Ethan said quietly, his voice shaky but real. Caleb froze. He couldn't even answer. Tears filled his eyes before he could stop them. He walked closer and sat beside the bed. His hands trembled as he touched Ethan's face. "You can really hear me?" he whispered. Ethan nodded and smiled. "Where's Grace?" The question hit harder than any blow. Caleb looked away. "She's not here." "Bring her," Ethan said softly. "She helped me. She's not bad." Caleb's throat tightened. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. Then he stood up and turned to the nurse at the door. "Tell the guards to release the maid. Bring her here." Minutes later, the door opened again. Grace walked in, her uniform wrinkled, her face pale but calm. She looked like someone who had cried too long but had no more tears left. Ethan's face lit up when he saw her. "Grace," he said, his voice weak but joyful. Grace covered her mouth, gasping. "You can still speak," she whispered. He nodded, laughing softly. "You helped me." Caleb stood silently, watching them. Something inside him cracked open. All the pride, the anger, the disbelief, it began to fade. What replaced it was guilt, deep, painful guilt. He looked at Grace and spoke quietly. "How did you know? How did you even think to look inside his ear?" Grace hesitated. Her voice was low. "I noticed him touching it every day. He was in pain. I thought maybe there was something small stuck there. I didn't want to hurt him, but I couldn't just watch." Caleb's eyes softened. "And you pulled that thing out?" She nodded. "I don't know what it was, sir. It moved. It looked like it had been there a long time." Caleb turned toward the doctor again, his voice trembling. "All these years, and not one of you checked properly. Not once." The doctor looked defeated. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson. This shouldn't have happened." Caleb exhaled deeply, his eyes wet. He looked back at Grace, standing there quietly. "You saw what none of them did," he said softly, "because you actually looked." Grace didn't answer. She just lowered her head. "I didn't do it for thanks, sir. I did it because I couldn't let him suffer." Caleb swallowed hard. His voice cracked as he said, "I thought money could fix everything. I was wrong." The room went silent. For a moment, all that could be heard was the faint hum of the machines beside Ethan's bed. Finally, Caleb spoke again, his tone calmer. "Grace, I owe you an apology. I should have listened. I was blinded by fear." Grace shook her head. You're a father. You were scared to lose him. I understand. Caleb's eyes glistened again. He nodded slowly, looking at her with something new in his expression respect. As the night grew quiet, he sat beside his son, holding his small hand. Ethan leaned against him, sleepy but smiling. Grace stood near the door, watching them. For the first time, there was peace in the room. Not the cold silence the mansion once had, but the warm kind, the kind that comes after tears. Yet deep inside, Caleb knew this was not the end. If the hospital had lied, others had too. He was about to uncover something much bigger than he imagined. And this time, he wouldn't be silent. Morning came slowly, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over what the night had revealed. The hospital corridors were quiet. Caleb hadn't slept. He sat in the waiting area, with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. His mind replayed every mistake he had made. He had trusted men in white coats more than he had trusted his own heart. He had signed checks without asking questions. And in doing so, he had let them turn his son into a business. When Grace walked up to him that morning, he didn't even notice her at first. She stood quietly, holding a paper cup of coffee in her hand. You should drink this, she said softly. You've been awake all night. Caleb looked up. His eyes were red, his face tired. You didn't have to bring me that, he said. Grace sat down beside him. You didn't have to believe in me either, she replied. For a moment, they sat in silence. But it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. It was peaceful, almost healing. Then Caleb spoke. The doctors admitted it, he said quietly. They knew what was happening. They kept it hidden because it brought them money. Grace closed her eyes briefly. That's cruel, she whispered. Caleb nodded slowly. I've spent years building things. Companies, systems, hospitals, programs. I thought I was helping people. But now I see that the world I helped create only listens when money speaks. Grace looked at him. Then change it, she said. You have the power to. He turned his head toward her, his eyes filled with something new purpose. You're right. I will. A few hours later, Caleb called a press conference right there in the hospital's conference room. Reporters filled the space, cameras flashing, microphones ready. No one knew why the famous businessman had suddenly called the media. Caleb stepped up to the microphone, his face calm but firm. Grace stood in the back corner, watching quietly. He began to speak slowly, each word steady and heavy with meaning. For 10 years, I was told that my son would never hear. I paid for the best doctors, the best technology, the best promises money could buy, and I believed them. But last night, a maid in my home did something no expert could. She gave my son back his hearing. The crowd murmured. Cameras clicked faster. He continued. What we discovered later is worse than I ever imagined. My son's condition was not fate, it was profit. He was kept sick so people could keep getting paid. The room went silent. The weight of his words hit everyone at once. Caleb lifted a folder filled with medical papers. These are the documents that prove it. Signed by people who swore an oath to heal, but chose greed instead. This is what happens when compassion is replaced by money. He paused, looking down for a moment before raising his head again. I was part of that world. I ignored what truly mattered. But from today, that changes. I am launching a new foundation-free medical care for every child with hearing problems, no matter where they come from or what they can pay. Reporters began clapping softly. Some wiped their eyes. Caleb's voice softened. And the first person I'm hiring to lead that mission is Grace. All heads turned toward her. She froze in surprise, her hand covering her mouth. Caleb smiled gently. She taught me what it means to listen, not with money, but with the heart. After the conference, when everyone left, Caleb found her outside the hospital entrance. The air was cool, the sun bright but gentle. Grace still looked shocked. Sir, you don't need to give me anything, she said quietly. I was only doing what was right. Caleb shook his head. You didn't just help my son. You opened my eyes. You reminded me that people matter more than power. She smiled faintly. I'm glad Ethan is okay. That's all I ever wanted. Caleb's expression softened. He keeps asking for you, you know. He won't stop saying your name. Her smile deepened slightly, tears welling in her eyes. He's a brave boy. When they returned to the room, Ethan was sitting up in bed, playing with a small toy car. He looked up as they entered and grinned. Grace, he called out. Grace's heart melted. She ran to him and hugged him gently. I missed you, she whispered. Ethan laughed softly. You sound happy, he said. Grace smiled through her tears. That's because I am. Caleb watched them quietly. For the first time in his life, he saw what love looked like when it was pure, simple, and real. It wasn't the kind that needed big gestures or fancy words. It was the kind that simply stayed. Days later, the mansion felt different. The air that once felt heavy now carried laughter. Ethan ran through the hallways, his little feet tapping against the floor. He still spoke slowly, carefully, but every word was a treasure. Grace returned to work, but not as a maid anymore. Caleb made her part of his household, someone trusted, someone family. Every evening, they all sat together in the garden, Caleb reading reports for the foundation, Grace teaching Ethan new words, and Ethan laughing at the sounds he once could never hear. Sometimes Caleb would just sit and watch them, the two people who had changed his life. In those moments, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, peace. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned orange, Ethan looked up from his drawing and asked, Dad, can I say something? Caleb smiled. Of course, son. Ethan pointed to Grace and said slowly, She's my hero. Grace covered her face, trying not to cry. Caleb looked at her with a proud smile. She's mine too, he said softly. Later that night, when everyone was asleep, Caleb stood by the window of his study, looking out at the quiet garden. The fountain outside glistened under the moonlight, the same one that used to remind him of silence. But tonight, it sounded different. He could hear the water, steady and alive, and it reminded him that silence was no longer his world. Grace passed by the doorway quietly. You're still awake? She asked. Caleb nodded. Just thinking. About what? He smiled gently. About how sometimes the smallest voice can change everything. Grace smiled too. That's true. They stood there in silence for a while. The good kind of silence. The kind that needed no words. When Caleb finally turned to her, his eyes were soft. Thank you, Grace. You didn't just give my son his hearing back. You gave me mine. She lowered her eyes humbly. Sometimes we all just need someone to listen. Caleb nodded. And this time, I will. Outside, the fountain kept flowing, the sound gentle and full of life. Inside, laughter echoed faintly from Ethan's room, a sound that would never again be taken for granted. For the first time, the Thompson mansion was not a house of silence, but a home filled with the sound of love. Dear viewers, sometimes, in life, silence doesn't come from our ears, it comes from our hearts. We get so busy chasing success, chasing comfort, that we stop hearing the people who truly need us. Mr. Caleb had all the money in the world, yet it took a maid with nothing but kindness in her heart to open his ears and his soul. She didn't heal his son with science or magic. She did it with love, with attention, with a heart that refused to ignore pain. Grace didn't just make a boy hear. She taught a father how to listen. And that is the greatest miracle of all. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or forgotten, remember this story. Because somewhere, someone like Grace still exists, someone who listens when the world stays silent. And sometimes, that's all it takes to bring back hope, to bring back life, and to remind us what it truly means to love. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And what lesson did you learn from Grace's story today? Your comment might inspire someone else to listen with their heart too.